The insistent chime of the intercom shattered the customary quiet of Marcus's study. He flinched, a precise line of Latin text blurring before his eyes. His reclusive existence, meticulously cultivated over 2 decades, rarely tolerated such intrusions. He pressed the talk button, a low growl of annoyance escaping him. "Marcus Thorne," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. "Mr. Thorne, this is Mr. Albright's office, regarding the estate of the late Alistair Finch." The voice, tinny and professional, offered no apology for the disruption. Marcus frowned. Alistair Finch? The name resonated with the faintest echo of a forgotten relative, a distant branch of his mother's family he hadn't known existed. He dismissed the thought as irrelevant. His world revolved around dusty archives, forgotten manuscripts, and the cold, empirical facts of history, not obscure genealogies. "I believe you have the wrong Marcus Thorne," he countered, already reaching for the switch to disconnect. "No, sir. Marcus Thorne, born October 17th, 1978, in Upper Fenwick, son of Eleanor Thorne, née Finch. The legal documents are quite explicit." Marcus paused, his thumb hovering over the button. Upper Fenwick, his birthplace. A jolt of something akin to unease, alien and unwelcome, prickled at him. He had no memory of Alistair Finch. He possessed no living relatives he acknowledged, let alone one significant enough to warrant legal correspondence. "What estate?" he asked, a determined skepticism hardening his tone. The solicitor's assistant, sensing a reluctant engagement, elaborated. "Mr. Finch, a distant relative, passed away last month. His will names you as the sole beneficiary of his estate, including Blackwood Manor." Blackwood Manor. The name struck Marcus with a sudden, unexpected chill, despite the warmth of his study. He knew Blackwood, not personally, of course, but from his historical research. It was a name whispered in hushed tones in obscure local histories, a place steeped in grim folklore. He had dismissed the tales as provincial superstition, the inevitable embellishments around an old, isolated structure. Yet, the mention of it now tied to his own name felt different. He felt a peculiar tightening in his chest, a sensation he immediately rationalized as indigestion. "Blackwood Manor?" he repeated, the words tasting like ash. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely, sir. We require your presence to sign the necessary papers. The property is extensive, and there are certain local sensitivities to address." Local sensitivities. Marcus snorted. More likely, local gossip, fueled by ignorance and fear. He, a historian dedicated to the meticulous reconstruction of past realities, found such irrationality tiresome. Yet, an undeniable, if unwelcome, pull began to exert itself. The opportunity to examine such a notorious place, to debunk its myths with first-hand observation, was, he conceded, a unique professional prospect. He agreed to an appointment, the phone receiver feeling unusually heavy in his hand as he replaced it. The journey was a descent into increasing isolation. The train rattled him through familiar urban sprawl, then into rolling green fields, finally depositing him at a desolate railway depot. The air here felt different, heavier, laden with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like old iron. A single, battered sedan, driven by a taciturn local, awaited him. The driver, a man with eyes that seemed to have seen too much of the local landscape, offered only curt acknowledgments as Marcus loaded his single, practical suitcase. The road narrowed, shedding its asphalt skin for a crumbling track of gravel and mud. Trees, ancient and gnarled, formed a dense canopy overhead, their branches clawing at the overcast sky. Marcus found himself scanning the encroaching woods, a primal instinct he usually suppressed asserting itself. He felt observed, though he saw nothing but the deepening gloom. Almost there, the driver grunted, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Then, through a sudden break in the trees, Blackwood Manor appeared. It did not stand so much as loom. A thick mantle of ivy, black and glistening, climbed its walls, giving the impression of a living, suffocating skin. A gate of wrought iron, rusted and ornate, sagged on broken hinges, offering an unimpeded view up a long, overgrown drive. Marcus's initial impulse was to analyze it, to categorize its architectural style, to estimate its age. But the sheer presence of the place overwhelmed such academic inclinations. The driver pulled up to the main entrance, a massive oak door studded with iron, which seemed to frown beneath a heavy stone lintel. He made no move to help with the luggage. "I'll wait at the crossroads for your call." The implication was clear. He wouldn't linger. Marcus stepped out. The gravel beneath his feet felt gritty and damp. A faint earthy scent, mingled with something metallic and sweet, like old blood and decaying leaves, permeated the air. He stood before the manor, a lone figure dwarfed by its immensity. His historian's mind, usually so sharp and logical, grappled for an explanation for the profound sense of unease that had settled over him. It was merely an old house, he told himself, exaggerated by local folklore and his own heightened expectations. He was a man of reason, of facts. The stone of the manor felt alive, almost warm beneath the ivy, despite its grim appearance. He hesitated, his hand hovering, a sudden, inexplicable reluctance seizing him. He pushed the thought away, dismissing it as fatigue and an overactive imagination. He was Marcus Thorne, the skeptical historian. He would not succumb to such fanciful notions. He knocked. The manor stood, a hulking silhouette against the slate-gray sky, exactly as Marcus had anticipated. Its stones, blackened by centuries of weather, exuded a cold, damp scent, a mingling of wet earth and ancient masonry. He surveyed the structure with a historian's eye, noting the architectural inconsistencies, the additions and alterations that spoke of successive owners, each leaving their indelible mark. This was not a place for ghost stories. It was a testament to time, to human endeavor, and ultimately, to decay. The opportunity to examine such a complex historical artifact from the inside, to reconstruct its narrative from its very fabric, outweighed any trivial local anxieties. His first priority was the retrieval of his research materials. Weeks earlier, he had arranged for his extensive collection of books, documents, and archival reproductions to be shipped via freight. The crates, heavy with the weight of accumulated knowledge, awaited him at the regional railway depot. A sprawling complex of corrugated iron and weathered timber. The journey, there was jarring. The paved road quickly giving way to a pitted gravel track that wound through skeletal trees. At the depot, a burly foreman directed him to a dimly lit section where his carefully labeled wooden containers rested, stacked like forgotten sarcophagi. Marcus oversaw the loading onto a hired flatbed truck, his gaze clinical, ensuring no box was mishandled. The driver, a taciturn man whose face was etched with sun and wind, maneuvered the vehicle with practiced ease, navigating the narrow lane leading to the manor. Back at the estate, the work began. Marcus directed the driver to unload the crates into what would become his primary study, a vast, high-ceilinged room on the ground floor. Its windows, tall and narrow, admitted a meager, watery light, filtering through panes caked with grime. The air within was stagnant, heavy with the scent of dust and something else. Something vaguely organic, like dried leaves or forgotten spices. He paid the driver, who departed without a backward glance, leaving Marcus in the echoing silence. He attacked the crates with methodical precision, a utility knife slicing through packing tape, a pry bar easing open wooden lids. Thousands of pages, neatly bundled and categorized, emerged. Volumes on medieval land tenure, monographs on regional folklore, treatises on architectural styles, all destined for their places on the empty shelves lining the study walls. The task was immense, but Marcus found a peculiar satisfaction in the physical labor, the meticulous arrangement of his intellectual arsenal. Marcus paused, rubbing his hands together. He attributed it to the sheer volume of space, the ancient stones struggling to retain any warmth. A structural issue easily explained. He continued, humming a low, tuneless melody as he sorted through a stack of parish records. Later, as he was carefully placing a fragile 17th century engraving onto a shelf, a sound caught his attention. A faint, almost imperceptible rustle, like dry paper skittering across a wooden floor. He turned, scanning the room. Nothing. The sound did not repeat. He considered the possibility of a mouse, or perhaps the house settling, its ancient timbers groaning under their own weight. He dismissed it as an auditory illusion, a product of an overtired mind. The next morning, the meticulous order he had imposed on his desk the previous evening seemed to have shifted. A heavy tome on heraldry, which he distinctly remembered leaving closed and centered, now lay open, its spine slightly skewed, resting beside his inkwell. A small, brass letter opener, a gift from a former colleague, was no longer beside his blotter but had migrated several inches to the left, almost to the edge of the desk. Marcus frowned. He prided himself on his precise habits. He must have moved them absent-mindedly and forgotten. The chaos of unpacking, he reasoned, was temporarily disrupting his usual routines. He returned the objects to their proper positions with a quiet sigh. Days bled into a week, each filled with the rhythmic labor of organization. The manor's vastness slowly yielded to his systematic approach. He found a small, locked cabinet built into the wall of a disused pantry, obscured by decades of dust and flaking paint. His historian's curiosity piqued. He returned to the study, rummaged through a box of miscellaneous tools, and selected a set of antique skeleton keys he acquired at a market years ago, purely for their aesthetic appeal. One, a slender, ornate piece of tarnished iron, slid into the lock with surprising ease. A soft click. Inside, nestled amongst brittle cobwebs and a layer of fine, gray dust lay a single leather-bound journal. Its covers were warped, its pages yellowed and delicate. The inscription on the first page, written in a spidery, faded hand, identified the author only as Elias. No surname, no date. Marcus carefully opened it, the dry paper emitting a faint, musty scent. The entries were sporadic, sometimes days, sometimes weeks apart. The initial tone was mundane, detailing weather patterns, minor repairs to the estate, and observations on local flora. But then, a subtle shift occurred. The quiet here is not an absence of sound, but a presence. It listens. Marcus paused, a faint line appearing between his brows. He read on, his clinical detachment momentarily faltering. I find myself rearranging objects I know I have not touched. A book, a quill, a stone from the garden. They migrate, inches at a time, but enough to register. Not drafts, no. These are pockets of absolute zero, like a breath held too long. They follow, they are no longer the house settling. They are words, just beyond the edge of understanding. They speak of hunger. Marcus felt a prickle of unease, a sensation he immediately filed away as a physiological response to the decaying air and the unsettling nature of the archaic prose. Elias, he concluded, was likely a man of fragile temperament, susceptible to the solitude of the manor. The psychological strain of isolation, a common affliction in historical accounts, could manifest in such delusions. He turned a page, the brittle paper almost tearing under his careful touch. The script had become more erratic, the lines slanting downwards, the ink occasionally smudged. It watches, it takes, not possessions, not yet, it takes the edges, the memories, ascertain these. I no longer trust my own hand, my own eye. The past shifts, the present blurs, it feeds on the very fabric of thought. Elias's descent into what appeared to be paranoia was tragically clear, yet the precision of Elias's descriptions, the mirroring of his own minor, easily rationalized occurrences, struck him with an unwelcome resonance. It was not an absence of sound, it was listening. Whispers from the walls, the letter opener, its polished steel cool beneath his fingertips, lay precisely where he'd left it on a mahogany desk. Elias's frantic scrawl had suggested a deliberate relocation, a subtle, malicious shift. Paranoia, he mused, was a powerful, insidious thing, capable of twisting mundane occurrences into portents of doom. Elias, poor man, had clearly succumbed to its grip. Marcus, a scholar of history, prided himself on a mind unclouded by such irrationality. He pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task at hand, sifting through the manor's archives. The vast library, with its towering shelves and scent of aged paper and dust, was his sanctuary. He sought patterns, historical facts, anything to explain the manor's grim reputation beyond local gossip. Days dissolved into a rhythm of research. He spent hours hunched over ledgers, diaries, and correspondence, the soft rustle of turning pages the loudest sound in the silence. But the silence wasn't always absolute. He'd pause, lift his head, and listen intently. Not there, only the creak of the ancient house settling, the wind sighing through the eaves. They danced at the periphery of his vision, fleeting blurs of deeper gray against the dusty light. A flicker in the corner of his eye, gone the moment he turned his head. He'd blink, rub his temples, attributing them to eye strain or the play of light from the tall, grimy windows. His determination remained unyielding. Every strange sensation was merely a product of an old house, isolation, and an overactive imagination fueled by Elias's warnings. Sleep, however, offered no such easy rationalizations. His nights became fractured, haunted by vivid, disorienting nightmares. He'd lie awake, listening to the house, and sometimes he would hear it, a distinct, rhythmic thud from the floorboards above, like heavy footsteps, or a low, mournful sigh that seemed to emanate from the very stone. He would tell himself it was just the wind, the old pipes, the house settling, but the rationalizations felt thinner, more brittle with each passing night. He discovered a meticulously kept family tree, cross-referenced with local parish records and newspaper clippings. There was the merchant, a man named Alastair Finch, who had purchased the estate in the late 17th century. His ledgers, brittle with age, detailed thriving trade routes, including regular shipments from the local railway depot. Then, abruptly, the entry ceased. A single, frantic page, dated 3 months after his wife's death, spoke of the stone crying out, the walls hungering. Finch vanished without a trace, declared lost at sea by his distant relatives, though no ship ever left port. Then, the reclusive scholar, Phineas Thorne, who inherited the manor in the mid-18th century, his personal journals, found tucked away in a locked chest, chronicled a descent into madness. Initially, it spoke of profound solitude, ideal for study, and a pervasive sense of being drained. His final entry was a single, stark sentence, it demands what is left. Thorne was found in the library, his throat slit, a crude, desperate act. The local constabulary ruled it suicide, noting his melancholy disposition. And most recently, the widowed matriarch Eleanor Vance, who lived alone in the manor for 20 years in the early 20th century. Her correspondence with a distant relative detailed her growing isolation, her complaints of a constant hum in the walls, and a feeling of being observed. The letters grew sparse, then stopped entirely. Marcus's skepticism, once an unyielding fortress, began to erode. He traced each lineage, each story, a common thread weaving through them all: prolonged isolation within the manor's confines, followed by madness, disappearance, or self-inflicted death. The rational explanations he'd clung to felt increasingly inadequate, like flimsy shields against an encroaching tide. He closed a heavy, leather-bound journal, the scent of its decay clinging to his fingers. The air in the library seemed to thicken, pressing against his eardrums. Only the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light and the unwavering, pervasive sense of being watched. The tightness in his chest returned, sharper this time. The house was not merely old. It was observant, it was patient, and it was waiting. Eleanor Vance's correspondence painted a stark picture of decline. The last letter, penned in a shaky hand, detailed not just her growing isolation, but a gnawing paranoia. A constant hum, she wrote, vibrates in the very bones of this house. It is never silent, never truly still. He described a feeling of being observed, of unseen eyes tracking him movements, and the chilling conviction that the walls remember and they judge. Marcus read the words again, tracing the faded ink with a fingertip. He considered Eleanor Vance's advanced age, her solitude, the likely onset of senility. It was a common narrative for isolated individuals, he reasoned, particularly within the confines of an ancient, creaking structure. His skepticism, a carefully cultivated intellectual shield, remained intact, if slightly dented by the raw despair in her final sentences. Yet, a subtle shift had occurred in the manor since his arrival. The pervasive quiet, once merely atmospheric, now felt deliberate, almost expectant. Sounds, when they came, were unnervingly precise. The distinct groan of a floorboard above him when no one was there, the faint scrape of something against plaster in an adjacent room, a sound too regular to be settling dust. One afternoon, while meticulously cataloging a collection of local parish records in the manor's library, a peculiar scent materialized. It was faint, at first, like dried lavender and something else, something metallic and sharp, reminiscent of old blood. Marcus paused, inhaling deeply. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering on the heavy velvet curtains, the rows of leather-bound tomes. Not there. He returned to his research, focusing on a ledger from the mid-19th century. As his gaze drifted over the ledger's meticulous script, the room seemed to ripple. A woman's low, guttural sob echoed, not in his ears, but within his skull. A resonant vibration that seized his very bones. His breath hitched. The air grew heavy, thick with the lavender and blood scent, now overpowering. The image was vivid, immediate yet intangible, like a photograph imprinted directly into his vision. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the vision receded. The scent dissipated. The desk was warm and dry again. Marcus sat rigid, his heart thudding against his ribs with an irregular rhythm. He clutched the edge of the desk knobbles white. His mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. Did I dress? A trick of the light, combined with the power of suggestion from Eleanor Vance's letters? He catalogued the sensory input: visual, auditory, olfactory, tactile, even emotional. It had been too complete, too intrusive to be a simple hallucination. The experience left him profoundly unsettled. He needed distance, a break from the pervasive atmosphere of the manor. The drive through the winding country lanes provided little relief. The landscape, ordinarily picturesque, now seemed to hold its breath. At the railway depot, the familiar sounds of industry, the distant clang of metal, the hiss of steam, the rumble of a departing freight car, were a welcome cacophony. The clerk, a stout man with a perpetual smudge of grease on his cheek, handed him a heavy, flat parcel. Marcus exchanged a few perfunctory words, his voice feeling strangely thin, his thoughts still trapped within the manor's walls. He looked out the large, dusty window of the depot, toward the distant hills where the manor lay hidden. Returning to the manor, the feeling of being observed intensified. He moved through the echoing halls, each creak and grunt of the old house resonating with new meaning. He tried to tell himself it was his imagination, a reaction to the strange vision, but his carefully constructed skepticism was fracturing. It was replaying them, forcing them upon him, as if demanding he bear witness to its long, agonizing history. And as he walked deeper into its silent embrace, he felt less like an observer and more like a participant in a story he was only just beginning to comprehend. The low thrum Eleanor Vance had described resonated now not just in Marcus's mind, but against his very bones. It was a subtle vibration, a constant, almost imperceptible tremor that seemed to emanate from the manor's deep foundations, a sound that bypassed the ears and settled directly into the core of his being. He found himself listening for it, sometimes even missing its absence during the brief, unsettling lulls. The previous letters had been a warning, the final one a lament. "It is never silent, never truly still," he had written, and Marcus understood. His skepticism, a lifelong anchor, felt increasingly tenuous. The house, in its vast silence, seemed to amplify his own thoughts, twisting them into unfamiliar shapes. He had unfinished research to pursue, a life beyond these crumbling walls. His first attempt to reconnect with the outside world was with a phone call. The landline, usually reliable, emitted only a flat, dead tone. He tried his mobile phone. No signal. He walked from room to room, holding the device aloft like a divining rod, but the screen remained stubbornly blank, a constant indicator of no service. Frustration pricked at him. He retrieved his car keys, the weight of them unfamiliar in his palm. The idea of the drive, the winding road back to civilization, felt strangely distant, almost irrelevant. A profound lethargy settled over him, heavy and unexpected. The thought of leaving the manor, even for a few hours, felt like a betrayal. "This is ridiculous," he thought, his internal voice weak, muffled. He pushed the door open, the old wood groaning in protest. He took a single step onto the gravel path, and an inexplicable wave of exhaustion washed over him. His legs felt heavy, his mind foggy. The sunlight, usually invigorating, seemed harsh, abrasive, and the world beyond the manor gates appeared bleached of color, devoid of interest. The hum of the house, which had momentarily faded, returned with renewed intensity, a reassuring thrum against his chest, a quiet invitation to return to its embrace. Reveal such discovery, he stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity, battling an invisible tide. His clothes were rumpled, his hair unkempt. He looked like a man who had been lost for months, not merely isolated for a few weeks. The house, in contrast, seemed to glow with a faint, internal luminescence, its ancient stones absorbing the daylight with an almost predatory efficiency. It was as if his own vitality, his own sharp edges, were being slowly smoothed away, absorbed into the very fabric of the building, leaving him diminished, while the house, in turn, became subtly more vibrant. He retreated, the front door closing with a soft sigh that sounded almost contented. The relief that flooded him was immediate, unsettling in its intensity. The outside world had begun to recede, becoming a hazy, unimportant concept. The railway depot, the rare maps, they were trivial concerns now, eclipsed by the immediate, palpable presence of the manor. Days blurred into an indistinguishable sequence. Marcus's routine fragmented. Personal hygiene became an afterthought. His research notes lay scattered, untouched, replaced by an obsessive, aimless wandering through the manor's echoing corridors. The manor's possessiveness was no longer merely a feeling. It was a tangible force, a quiet, insistent presence that wrapped around him like a shroud. The house was his world now, its vastness a substitute for any external connection. He was no longer trying to escape. He was settling in, deeper and deeper, into the heart of its quiet consumption. It was like living inside a vast, sleeping engine, its slow, powerful pulse a constant reminder of something immense and hidden beneath the earth. His determination, once a solid anchor, had begun to fray around the edges. He had set out to document the manor's history, to expose the superstition for what it was. He often found himself standing in the library, not remembering why he had entered, or what book he had been seeking. The titles on the shelves would sometimes shimmer, the gold leaf lettering blurring into indecipherable patterns before resolving back into familiar words. One morning, Marcus descended the grand staircase, his hand trailing along the polished mahogany banister. The wood felt unusually cold, slick with a fine, almost imperceptible film. He paused at the landing, a sudden, disorienting sensation washing over him. The stained glass window at the end of the hall, which usually depicted a pastoral scene of deer grazing by a stream, now showed a stark, geometric pattern of interlocking gears and levers, casting fractured, industrial light across the Persian rug. He blinked, rubbing at his eyes. When he looked again, the deer were back, serene and unmoving. He shook his head, a dull ache throbbing behind his temples. It was fatigue, he told himself, nothing more. But the subtle alterations continued. A door he remembered leading to his small antechamber now opened into a dusty, unused storage closet. A portrait of a grim-faced ancestor in the dining hall seemed to shift its gaze, following him with unnerving precision. He started to question his own recollections, doubting the veracity of his memories. Had the antechamber always been a closet? Had the portrait always been so animated? He found an old leather-bound journal tucked away in a drawer of a writing desk in what he thought was the master bedroom. The script was elegant, Faded ink on brittle, yellowed paper. It belonged to an Elias Thorne, a former resident who had lived in the manor in the late 18th century. Marcus began to read, hoping for insights into the manor's architectural evolution. They shift, they breathe. My study, once a sanctuary, now feels like a cage of constantly rearranging bars. He read on, his eyes scanning the elegant loops and flourishes. My wife, Amelia, she sees nothing. She calls me mad. But Marcus know what Marcus see. Marcus know, this house is not still. A jolt went through Marcus. He looked down at the handwriting. It seemed familiar. He traced a word with his finger, feeling a strange resonance. It was it his own hand that had written these words? The thought was absurd, yet it clung to him with an unnerving tenacity. He could almost feel the phantom weight of a quill in his hand, the scent of fresh ink. Later that afternoon, driven by a growing sense of unease and a desperate need to reassert his own reality, Marcus decided to revisit the library, to immerse himself in his own research. He walked down the familiar corridor, the thrum intensifying, vibrating through the floorboards. He reached the heavy oak door, its brass handle cool beneath his palm. Instead, a vast, cavernous space unfolded before him. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, damp earth, and something metallic, like rust and ozone. Overhead, a colossal, riveted iron ceiling soared into the gloom, crisscrossed by immense steel beams. On either side, derelict platforms rose, choked with forgotten wooden crates and corroded machinery. He was standing in a railway depot. The library was gone. The manor had swallowed it, replacing it with this monstrous, industrial maw. His breath hitched in his throat. The sheer scale of the space dwarfed him, making him feel utterly insignificant. The thrum intensified, no longer a subtle vibration, but a deep, resonant hum that filled the vast expanse, seeming to emanate from every rivet, every length of rail. He spun around, desperate to find the door he had just entered through, but there was only a seamless stretch of riveted iron wall, indistinguishable from the rest. He ran his hands over the cold metal, searching for an outline, a seam, anything. There was nothing. The wall was solid, unyielding, but the memories were fragmented, like shards of broken glass. He saw a lecture hall, then a familiar face, then a blank. The throbbing in his bones intensified, pushing against his skull, a relentless pressure. He was Marcus. He was a historian. He was Elias Thorne. The names blurred, the faces shifted. A chill, distinct from the house's pervasive damp, had settled deep within Marcus. The familiar handwriting, the words, the consumption, the slow decay, the hunger, etched onto the crumbling plaster of the manor's walls, continued to echo in his mind. He had tried to dismiss it, to attribute it to exhaustion, to the relentless stress of the place. Perhaps he had written them in a fugue state, a temporary lapse of reason induced by the manor's oppressive atmosphere. The thought, while unsettling, felt marginally less terrifying than the alternative, that the words had simply appeared, or that his memory was actively being manipulated. Weeks ago, he had arranged for a collection of archived letters and journals belonging to Eleonora Blackwood, a previous inhabitant whose descent into madness was well documented, to be shipped from a distant historical society. He had hoped they would provide a clearer historical context for the manor's peculiarities, a rational explanation for the local superstitions. The notification for their arrival had been tucked into his coat pocket days ago, a small rectangle of paper with a neat, impersonal font. Driving away from the manor felt like surfacing from a deep, murky dive. The air outside was crisp, the sky a muted gray, and the familiar rhythm of the engine offered a temporary reprieve from the manor's silent, watchful presence. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, a tension in his jaw he hadn't realized was there. The journey to the railway depot was a routine task, yet it felt charged with an unusual significance. It was an attempt to anchor himself, to prove to his own mind that objective reality still existed, separate from the manor's distortions. The railway depot was a sprawling, utilitarian structure of brick and steel, a stark contrast to the manor's ancient stone. Inside, the air hummed with the low thrum of machinery and the distant shriek of train brakes. The space smelled of oil, dust, and something vaguely metallic. A uniformed clerk, his face obscured by the brim of his cap, processed the paperwork with practiced efficiency. Marcus provided his identification, signed the necessary forms, and within minutes, a sturdy wooden crate, bound with thick twine, was presented to him. The weight of it in his arms felt substantial, reassuringly real. He drove back, the crate secured in the passenger seat. He considered waiting, examining the contents immediately, but a strange compulsion pulled his back to the manor. Inside, nestled amongst packing straw, were several leather-bound journals and a bundle of faded letters tied with a ribbon. He selected one of Eleonora's journals, its cover brittle with age, and opened it to a random page. The script was delicate, looping, undeniably Eleonora's. He had studied her work extensively, knew her peculiar turns of phrase, her recurring motifs. He began to read, his eyes scanning the faded ink. It was a passage detailing a particularly harsh winter, the struggles with dwindling supplies, the isolation. It takes my dreams first, then the names of things, then the faces I hold dear. Marcus frowned. He paused, rereading the line. He knew Eleanor Blackwood's journals. He had read them, studied them, cited them in his own research. This particular passage, it was not there. He remembered her lamenting her loneliness, her growing paranoia, but never this explicit, almost poetic description of the house's malevolence. He flipped back through the pages he had just read. The description of the winter, the supplies. It was all there, just as he remembered, but the sentence about the walls and their hunger felt like an insertion, a seamless graft onto existing text. He pulled another journal from the crate, one he had annotated himself years ago, its spine familiar beneath his fingers. He opened it to a page he knew by heart, a detailed account of Eleanor's gardening efforts. He remembered a specific passage where she meticulously listed the varieties of roses she cultivated. He read, his brow furrowing deeper. The list was there, but a crucial detail was missing. The crimson Blackwood rose, a unique hybrid he was known for, the one he had tried to find in the manor's overgrown gardens. It was simply absent from the text, as if it had never been mentioned. Had he misremembered? Had he conflated details from different sources? He was a historian. Precision was his trait. His memory for facts, for dates, for specific textual details was impeccable. Yet, here, staring at the physical evidence, his own knowledge seemed to waver, to contradict the very source material he held. He closed his eyes, pressing his thumb and forefinger to his temples. A blankness. It was as if a portion of his mind had been cleanly excised, leaving no scar, only an absence. A jolt went through him, a terrifying clarity. His own fading, shifting memories. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening precision. The manor was not merely haunted. It was not a repository of residual energy, a passive echo of past suffering. It was alive, a sentient, malevolent entity, and it fed. It fed on the memories, the sanity, the very life force of those within its walls. It absorbed their histories, their identities, growing stronger, more defined, with each victim. They were the methodical, deliberate acts of a predator. Marcus looked around the study at the heavy oak furniture, the dusty bookshelves, the portrait of a stern-faced ancestor whose eyes seemed to follow him. The house was not just a container. It was the mouth, the stomach, the digestive system. He was its current, preferred meal. The slow decay had begun. The falsified passage in Eleanor Blackwood's journal solidified Marcus's understanding. This was not a haunting, nor a lingering echo. This was an active, malevolent intelligence capable of reshaping not only his present perception, but the very historical record he held sacrosanct. A cold, clinical rage began to coalesce within him, hardening the edges of his fear. The house was not merely consuming him. It was erasing truth. He pushed away from the heavy oak desk, the leather of the chair groaning in protest. His objective was clear. Find a point of vulnerability, a way to sever the entity's hold, or failing that, to destroy it. He moved with a renewed, almost manic energy, his gaze sweeping over familiar details of the library, searching for anomalies he had previously dismissed. Every shadow now seemed deeper, every creak of the floorboards a deliberate taunt. His fingers traced the intricate carvings on the mantelpiece, feeling for a loose section of wood. The house seemed to breathe around him, a low, resonant hum emanating from the very foundations, vibrating through the soles of his boots. It was a sound that had once been a comforting ambient noise. Now, it was a predatory purr. He moved from the library to the adjoining drawing room, then to the vast, empty ballroom. The house's attempts to disorient him began almost immediately. A grandfather clock in the hall, which he distinctly remembered being near the main staircase, now stood against the far wall of the ballroom, its pendulum swinging with a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to drag time itself. He ignored it, focusing his intent. The house was trying to scatter his thoughts, to make him doubt his own observations. He would not yield. His search became more frantic, less methodical. He opened a door he believed led to the servants' quarters, expecting the narrow, winding passage. Overhead, skeletal iron girders crisscrossed a vaulted ceiling, partially obscured by a perpetual twilight. He was no longer in the manor, or rather, the manor had worked itself around him, creating this impossible internal landscape. He stepped inside, the heavy oak door swinging shut behind him with a dull thud that echoed unnaturally. The sheer scale of the space was disorienting. The air was thick with the ghost of industry, the smell of grease, soot, and the metallic tang of corrosion. He moved forward, his footsteps echoing in the immense space. Overturned handcarts lay scattered like forgotten toys. He saw what looked like a signal box, its windows shattered, its internal mechanisms a tangled mess of broken levers and snapped wires. This was a vision of abandonment, of forgotten purpose. His historian's instinct, however distorted by the house's influence, still guided him. This place, this railway depot, must hold a clue. It felt too specific, too deliberately manifested to be a random illusion. He scanned the walls, the few remaining signs, the debris on the floor. He noticed a small, recessed office within the signal box, its door hanging ajar. Pushing the door open, he stepped into a cramped, dusty space. A single, rickety wooden desk stood against one wall, covered in a thick layer of grime. Papers, brittle and yellowed, were scattered across its surface, indecipherable under the dust. He swept them aside, his gaze drawn to a faint glint beneath a collapsed ledger. It bore no markings, no distinguishing features, yet its presence here, in this impossible railway depot, felt profoundly significant. It had a simple clasp. He pressed it, and the lid sprang open with a faint click. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single sheet of parchment. It was aged, the edges frayed, the ink faded but still legible. He pulled it out carefully, his fingers trembling slightly. The script was an archaic hand, unfamiliar yet somehow comprehensible. 3 times the blood of the forgotten, 3 times the breath of the lost, 3 times the word unsaid. A sacrifice not of flesh, but of severance. The relic, imbued with the dawn's first light, placed at the threshold of the deep sleep, when the hunger is greatest. The stone weeps, the root groans the heart of the vessel, and the cost was unclear, but implied to be significant. The relic, imbued with the dawn's first light, an artifact, a specific time, when the hunger is greatest. He clutched the parchment, the paper rustling softly. He had found it, a terrifying, obscure instruction. The walls of the signal box began to shimmer, the illusion wavering. Marcus knew he had little time. He had found a glimmer, but the coming dawn felt impossibly far away. He clutched the parchment, the paper rustling softly. The terrible instruction, a path forward, felt both a burden and a lifeline. The oppressive cold that had settled within the railway depot receded, a subtle withdrawal, as if the very air itself exhaled. Marcus registered this minute shift, a faint, almost imperceptible easing of the pressure, but it was enough to fuel a desperate resolve. He stood amidst the skeletal remains of forgotten machinery, the rusting iron and splintered sleepers of the railway depot cold against his boots, the silence now less absolute, more anticipatory. The house was not retreating, it was gathering itself. He moved towards the arched doorway that led back into the main structure, the parchment folded tightly in his hand. The first sign of overt resistance was immediate. The massive, iron-bound door, which had been ajar moments before, groaned and slammed shut with a concussive force that vibrated through the floor. Dust, thick and ancient, rained from the lintel. Marcus flinched, a jolt of adrenaline searing through him. This was not a draft, not decay. This was deliberate. He tried the handle. The cold metal resisted his grip, unyielding. He pressed his ear to the wood, hearing only the faintest echo of the impact. He pivoted, searching for an alternate route. The instruction was specific, demanding action within a particular sequence of rooms, a precise unraveling of the house's woven malevolence. Deviation was not an option. He found a narrow service passage he had previously overlooked, tucked behind a crumbling wall of shelves laden with rusted tools. As he stepped into the gloom, a sudden, sharp crack echoed from above. A section of the ceiling, plaster and lath, detached itself and plummeted, not randomly, but directly in his path, creating a small, impassable mound of debris. He stopped short, dust stinging his eyes. The house was a living labyrinth, now actively reconfiguring itself to trap him. Marcus's jaw tightened. He pressed on, turning down another corridor, his movements becoming more urgent, less exploratory. As he rounded a corner, a spectral figure shimmered into existence before him. She floated, arms outstretched, her mouth a silent O of anguish. A wave of profound sorrow, not his own, washed over him, threatening to drown his resolve. He stumbled, catching himself on the rough plaster of the wall. This was beyond mere vision. This was an active impediment, a psychological assault woven with physical force. He gritted his teeth, pushing through the wave of despair, forcing himself to take another step. He broke free, the figure dissolving behind him as he hurried on. The house was alive, and it was furious. The next corridor he entered was different. The walls, usually grimy and peeling, shimmered with a faint, ephemeral glow. The air grew thick, humid, carrying the cloying scent of long-dead roses and the faint, metallic tang of old iron. He was no longer in the decaying manor. He was in a sun-drenched conservatory, vibrant with potted ferns and blooming flowers, the air buzzing with the murmur of polite conversation. 2 figures, a man in a waistcoat and a woman in a voluminous gown, sat across from each other, their faces indistinct, their voices a low, unintelligible drone. Marcus stopped, frozen. This was a memory, one of the house's countless echoes, but this time, it was more than an observation. He could feel the warmth of the sun on his skin, the soft texture of the velvet armchair he stood beside, the faint vibrations of the conversation in the air. The woman then looked up, his head tilting, his gaze locking onto Marcus with an unnerving intensity. Her indistinct lips parted, and a high, keening sound, utterly devoid of joy, pierced the air. The warmth vanished, replaced by a sudden, glacial drop in temperature. The roses withered, their petals crumbling to dust. The ferns turned brittle and snapped. He felt the weight of their despair, their anger, their trapped existence. He was not merely witnessing a memory, he was being drawn into it, threatened with becoming another echo. He closed his eyes, pressing the parchment against his forehead. He focused on the rough texture of the paper, the dry, ancient scent of it. He needed to anchor himself. He was Marcus. Here, now. This was not real. This was a trick, a lure. He opened his eyes. The house was fighting, not with brute force, but with a cunning malice designed to unmoor him completely. It sought to break his will, to blur the lines of his perception until he no longer knew what was real, what was past, what was himself. But the parchment in his hand, the promise of an end however terrifying, kept him moving. He was battered, his mind reeling from the sensory overload, but his determination, a fragile, burning ember, refused to be extinguished. Marcus registered this minute shift, a faint warmth returning to his extremities, a temporary reprieve from the gnawing chill that had become his constant companion. He clutched the parchment, the paper rustling softly, the terrible instruction it bore feeling both a crushing burden and a desperate lifeline. He had made his choice. There was no turning back from this precipice. His boots scraped on the grimy concrete of the railway depot floor as he turned, the low hum of the structure a dull thrum against his eardrums. The air, though warmer, now carried a faint, metallic tang like old iron and stale blood. It was a smell he had come to associate with the house's deepest, most ancient corners. These were the house's distractions, its attempts to divert or dissuade. He had learned to filter them, to focus on the objective. The journey back through the manor was a gauntlet of psychological torment. Each step from the railway depot felt like traversing a tightening vise. Corridors stretched and contracted, ceilings pressed low, then soared to impossible heights. The familiar grandeur of the hall dissolved into a shifting tapestry of ancestral portraits, their eyes following him, their painted lips twisting into silent, mocking grimaces. He saw his own reflection in polished wood, but the image was subtly wrong. Eyes too wide, skin too pale, a tremor in the jaw that wasn't his own. He pressed on, his breath shallow, a dry ache in his throat. He found the hidden entrance not in the library, nor in the grand dining room, but behind a simple, unassuming tapestry in a lesser-used antechamber. He had nearly overlooked it in his previous frantic searches, dismissing the space as merely decorative. The parchment had indicated its location with cryptic precision. Where the thread unravels, the root descends. He ran his fingers along the raised embroidery of a faded hunting scene, searching for the mechanism. His hand brushed against a loose knot of thread, pulling it. With a low, grinding groan, a section of the stone wall recessed, revealing a narrow, lightless aperture. It was a smell that spoke of profound antiquity, of rock and deep time. He took a single, measured breath, steeling himself. The passage was a steep descent, rough-hewn and claustrophobic. This was not the familiar creaking of an old house settling. This was a rhythmic, organic pulse. The house was not merely a structure. It was a vast, subterranean organism, and he was descending into its very viscera. The passage widened abruptly into a vast, cavernous space. No torchlight, no lamp, yet a faint, phosphorescent glow emanated from the walls themselves, illuminating a spectacle that stole Marcus's breath. This was the core. The chamber was immense, a natural grotto of black, glistening stone. But it was not merely natural. They were not roots of any plant he knew, but something alien, organic, yet stony. From these tendrils, finer filaments branched out, translucent and shimmering, like spun glass. They converged at the center of the chamber, forming a grotesque, beating heart. Within its depths, Marcus saw flickers, impossible fragments of memories. A child's laughter, a woman weeping, a man's silent despair, a forgotten dream. They were not coherent images, but raw emotional echoes, like motes of dust caught in a light beam, constantly shifting, consumed and reformed. This was the house's sustenance, its very lifeblood, drawn from those who had inhabited its halls. This was the terrible reveal. It was a predator of the soul. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over him, a sudden, debilitating drain. He felt his own memories begin to unravel, his own sense of self fraying at the edges. He saw flashes of his childhood, his academic triumphs, the faces of distant colleagues, all becoming thin, translucent, ready to be pulled into the vortex. The house was already attempting to claim him, to consume the very knowledge he held. He fought through the encroaching mental fog, gripping the parchment tighter. His fingers felt numb, his limbs heavy. He moved toward the pulsating core, each step an act of sheer will. The parchment was a map, a ritual, a weapon. He had to perform the terrible instruction before he himself became another shimmering fragment, lost forever in the house's insatiable hunger. He clutched the rusted iron lever, its surface gritty beneath his palm, and felt a tremor of something akin to vindication. The entity was faltering. His relentless probing, his refusal to yield his core identity, was exacting a toll. Marcus's analytical mind attempted to categorize this new state. Was it a retreat, a strategic withdrawal, or something more insidious? His skepticism, though fractured, still clung to the edges of his perception, urging him to distrust any perceived advantage. The railway depot itself seemed to solidify around him. The phantom steam, which had previously wreathed the skeletal carriages and tracks, thinned, revealing the true scale of the dereliction. Piles of corroded metal, stacks of splintered timber, and the endless glint of parallel rails stretching into the pervasive gloom. The air, though warmer, now carried a distinct metallic tang, a coppery scent that pricked at his nostrils, reminiscent of old blood and electrical discharge. He observed a slow, viscous drip from an unseen overhead pipe, the sound echoing with unnatural clarity in the sudden quiet. His own memories, which had been a chaotic maelstrom, began to coalesce, but with an unsettling clarity. He saw the face of his former colleague, heard the dismissive tone of the university committee, felt the familiar weight of a rare manuscript in his hands. He interpreted this as a victory, a reclamation of self, a flicker of hope, dangerous and fragile, ignited within him. Then, the true nature of the withdrawal began to manifest. The returned clarity of his memories was not singular. Interspersed among them, now equally vivid, were the memories of others. He saw a young woman in a faded dress, standing on a platform, her face etched with a desperate longing for a departing train. He felt the crushing disappointment of a man who missed his connection, the quiet desperation of a family relocating to an unknown city. These were not fragments. They were full, immersive experiences, absorbed without his conscious consent. His brain processed them with the same immediacy as his own, blurring the lines not between past and present, but between his past and their pasts. The sensation was not of remembering, but of being them, briefly, fully. A low hum began to emanate from the very structure of the railway depot, a deep vibration that resonated in his bones. It was not a mechanical sound, but something organic, like the sustained thrum of a vast, living organism. The tracks beneath his feet seemed to pulse, a faint, internal luminescence flickering along their length, revealing the impossible distances they traversed, curving into walls, disappearing into the floor, branching into labyrinthine patterns that defied logic. This was not a retreat. This was an invitation. The warmth, the clarity, the sudden vividness of memories, they were not signs of the entity's weakness, but rather symptoms of its ultimate embrace. It was showing him what it could offer, what it was, a vast living repository of countless lives, an eternal archive of human experience, and he was being offered a place within it. He tried to scream, to lash out, but his limbs felt heavy, anchored. He could perceive the railway depot as a complex, interconnected system, each track a neural pathway, each carriage a vessel of dormant consciousness. The warmth was the assimilation, the integration. He had not wounded it. He had merely become another memory it absorbed, another piece of its vast, terrifying consciousness. His thoughts were no longer solely his own. They were interwoven with the silent narratives of countless others. He perceived the world through a multitude of eyes, felt joy and sorrow that were not his own, yet were undeniably felt. Marcus, the skeptical historian, the reclusive scholar, was dissolving, his identity diffusing into the collective. He was no longer an inhabitant, he was a component. His last distinct thought was a clinical observation, detached and horrifying. The escape was an illusion. The absorption is complete. Marcus, I'm no longer Marcus. Marcus, I'm the depot. Marcus, I'm the house. A faint metallic taste bloomed on his tongue, the coppery tang now familiar, almost comforting. He registered the slow, viscous drip from the pipe overhead, no longer as an external sound, but as an internal rhythm, the slow, deliberate pulse of a vast, ancient heart. The tracks stretched into eternity, and he, Marcus, now existed within every one of them, a silent witness, a permanent memory, an integral, terrifying part of the manor's endless, consuming existence, and with it, a profound, clinical understanding of absolute stillness.